Okay, we
Oh,
are.
hang on. No, wait, because
uh,
you're gonna need to cut I have to click the thing off the screen. There's a big warning comes up going, "This is being recorded."
oh yeah, that's fine. I don't have it on my end, but yeah. But yeah, it tells you this is being recorded, right? Yeah. All right, but no worries. We are recording, and I am joined here today by my excellent friend, Dr. AP Canavan. Hello, AP. How are you?
I am doing very well, Philip. I am really enjoying these discussions that we're having about archetypes. It's actually a lot of fun.
It is. I'm having a lot of fun with it, and I hope that our viewers are as well. But this is part 4 of our series on archetypes. And part 1 was a fascinating look at the mage and, the wise mage and the intelligent magician. And part 2 was a look at the rogue and the trickster. And now we have done recorded part 3, which will be out before this video, I'm pretty sure. And that will be on AP's channel, Critical Dragon, and you can find that. And that's our introduction. So we're doing that one a little out of order, but better late than never, right, AP?
My fault. So, yes, this is still part 4. I think
Yeah.
should I actually renumber the videos so that the introduction now gets number 1? I would just add the introduction's part 3. Think of
Yeah.
it as starting in media res.
Yeah. It's in media res. Brilliant. I love it. We're going with that. So anyway, this is part 4 no matter what. And part 4 is going to be on the lover and the caregiver. These are two different archetypes, but we like to pair them because there's often overlap between, really can be from any of the archetypes, but these pairings kind of make sense to us, just like putting the introduction as part 3. So
And peanut butter and jelly.
here we go. Yeah. So, yeah, we're talking about the lover and the caregiver today. And I think we have some interesting examples for people. And I want to give a spoiler warning from the beginning. We are going to be using examples and in a vaguish, spoilery way, but nothing too specific or major. So if you're really sensitive to spoilers, then well, I'm going to warn you right now. We are going to talk about examples from the Farseer trilogy and from Lord of the Rings, and hopefully everybody's heard of that one. And also, what was our other one? Oh, of course, the Malazan Book of the Fallen, specifically Dead House Gates and Memories of Ice, I think, right? So that's your spoiler warning, and we're no big, huge spoilers here, but you could consider them vague spoilers, I think.
And in fact, the easiest we'll have our general sort of talk about, one of the concepts, and then
Yeah.
we can say which book that we're going to go into, just so if you want to skip it.
Mm-hmm. We'll do that. So let's talk about the lover, I guess, first. And do we want to talk about our examples first? Or do we want
Well,
to bring up that chart again so people can see? Um,
why don't I share the chart, because I think that the chart actually comes in quite handy because it helps us articulate and show what it is that
yeah.
we are actually talking about.
Yeah. And we looked at this chart in part 3, the introduction.
So if you look in the bottom left hand corner there is lover, and then opposite that is seducer.
Ah,
And what is being suggested here is the lover at their core is, it's about love, obviously with lover, but an idea of physical love or romantic love or eros, and then that shadow version of it. So with love, the lover, it's about the building of a good relationship, a supportive relationship where you bring happiness, joy, intimacy, everything is in a positive light. But with the shadow archetype, the seducer, it is about the egocentric view of using physical intimacy for personal
right,
gain or
right.
to destroy someone. And for me, a perfect illustration of this would be James Bond.
Hmm.
James Bond. Spoilers for James Bond. He sleeps with people. But a lot of the James Bond stories are about him targeting women to sleep with in order to further his own plans, to further his own goals, his to gain an advantage in some way. He uses them. So he's more that shadow archetype in that sense there of a seducer as opposed to a lover. Casanova, on the other hand, classical example of the lover, because although he slept with a lot of women, it was always about bringing pleasure to both parties. It was about
Uh-huh.
the giving of pleasure to someone else.
Hmm.
So I think that's an interesting dynamic that you can think about lover and seducer. But in terms of archetype, perhaps in literature, the most common one that we think of in terms of lover is love interest, and
Yeah.
that's one of the ways to think about it. But the concept goes beyond love interest, but the easiest examples typically are found there.
Yeah. Yeah. So we will have, I think, a few good examples in, well, let's start with Lord of the Rings. Let's start with the oldest one. And here you have, romance is not central to Lord of the Rings, but you do have a couple pairings, if you will. In, let's start with Faramir and Eowyn. And that happens late in the trilogy or in the story, if you think of it as one story. But Faramir and Eowyn both come to a point where they meet each other. They're both healing from their wounds, and the intimacy that is hinted at that they will have is very much a part of their healing, isn't it? It's a part of them becoming whole people once again. So that's the what you mentioned before, the intimacy being a helpful, a good thing, a healing thing, for this pairing of Faramir and Eowyn. Also, interestingly, it can be a matter of perspective, can't it, as to who is the hero and who is the lover, correct? I mean, you could think of one or the other, right?
Yeah, and this is a point that I like about narrative perspective, because so often when we think about characters, we go, "This is who the character is," and that's who the character is from a particular narrative point of view.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you know, Harry Potter is, oh, he's the hero of the Harry Potter stories. But if you think of the stories from Draco's point of view, Harry's really annoying and he's the bad guy.
Right.
Because in that sense, it's one of the reasons why we talk about protagonists and antagonists. Protagonist is usually the focus and the driving force of the story. The antagonist is opposing them. So if the story is from one perspective, i.e., the pro, we can see their lover is going to be the other person. So if the story is from Faramir's perspective, if we place him centrally and we go, who is Faramir's lover? In that case, it's Eowyn.
Mm-hmm.
But we can reverse that, because we can, if we place Eowyn centrally, then her lover is going to be Faramir.
Right.
And so it's an interesting way of understanding how you can shift narrative perspective, that you don't always have to obey and follow exactly what the text is saying. You can think about these people from a different perspective.
Yeah. Very interesting. Yeah. And of course, the real hero of Harry Potter is Hermione anyway. So but yeah, no, that's brilliant, because Eowyn does have a very important arc of her own and plays a very heroic role in the story, doesn't she? And so the healing that Faramir offers her, in that way of seeing it, he is the lover, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, oh, and very nice. And of course, you also have Aragorn and Arwen, whose relationship is played up much more in the films than in the actual book. But they're also a pairing, of a sort.
And much more stereotypical, much more conventional, in that Aragorn is hero and Arwen is, in a lot of respects, the hero's reward, that she's been relegated to that. So this is where the concept of the archetype actually comes in handy, because you go, yeah, that's exactly how Arwen has been packaged. She is the lover of Aragorn,
Yeah.
and she is the reward for Aragorn. So you can see where some of that criticism of Tolkien's attitude to female characters comes in, because that is really how Arwen is packaged in it. Even if Tolkien himself cared very much for the character of Arwen,
Yeah.
in the story, in the narrative, and how it is narrated to the reader. That's her function, that's her role. So you can see where that archetype actually describes her almost to a T, because that's all that she is within the text.
Yeah. Yeah. Very interesting. Huh. Well, let's talk then about the Farseer trilogy. Let's move on to that. So spoilers, slight spoilers for that if you haven't read Farseer yet. But we're going to talk about Fitz and Molly as a couple, and the intimacy that develops between them. And that also, I think, takes on an important aspect of healing for both characters, doesn't it? Molly coming from what amounts to a kind of an abusive household, and finding the I think comfort of having someone like Fitz in her life, although it gets complicated. And then of course Fitz, who goes through no end of pain in the books. He finds an object of desire in Molly, doesn't he? In a very youthful way.
Yeah, and what I find interesting about this is, again, it's an illustration of how, because Fitz is so complicated as a character, that you can make that assumption. Oh, Molly is just love interest. Molly is just lover. But one of the big strengths, obviously, of Hobbes' writing is no character is relegated to something so two-dimensional or even one-dimensional. That Molly is, again, one of these characters that we realize what is happening in terms of trying to describe her in archetypal terms doesn't work to fully encompass what's going on. She's not an Arwen. She's much more complicated than Arwen. And so that's one of the ways that we can use to differentiate between things that you go, oh, she's just love interest. But we can see that she isn't just a love interest. She isn't just the lover to Fitz. She
Right.
is a character in and of her own right. And that complexity comes across so well in Hobbes' writing.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. Speaking of complexity, our third example is going to be from the Malazan Book of the Fallen. And this is an example that you came up with, AP, and I think it's just brilliant because it shows a whole different side to this archetype, the lover. And I think it's an important one because it shows us that it's not the physicality of it isn't central necessarily, is it? So the
No.
example that you raised was
Well,
grunting.
hang on a sec. But
Yeah,
this is spoilers for Memories of Ice,
memory
and
works. Yeah,
genuinely, we need to talk about a couple of things here, and I wouldn't want to ruin this for anyone, but
right,
I'll try to keep it as general as possible. But it's the third book in a series rather than something quite early on. So,
right, right.
but it's Stani, Menakis, and Gruntle.
Yes.
And one of the reasons why I think this is quite interesting is they do not have a physical relationship depicted in the novels. That's not their relationship. But it is very, very clear that they love one another. That
Yeah.
we're not talking about eros in that romantic sexual sense, but we're talking about genuine love between two people.
Mm-hmm.
And they support each other, they love each other, they care for one another. And I think that is very, very strong in the text. And it's a way of seeing these archetypes as slightly more than just the one-dimensional aspect. You go, oh, it's all about sex, or it's all about that type of relationship.
Right.
You go, it's a concept. It's broader than that, in the same way that it is also just one concept.
Yeah.
But it is broader than something just as simplistic as sex. And with how we see Gruntle react to what happens to Stunny, my thoughts on that particular narrative framing aside,
Yeah. Yeah.
his reaction to that shows his depth of feeling for her, and
Yes.
his immediate reaction and what he does then to help her shows that depth of emotion, that depth of feeling. And I think that strong emotional undercurrent shows that depth of love, which is, I think, an important aspect of the concept of lover.
Yeah, yeah. And in case you didn't notice, all even before that, the way in which they related to one another, They were, yes, they're old friends, but they seemed like a married couple to me even before the big stuff goes on. So it just in the way that they relate to one another, they could probably finish each other's sentences, that sort of thing. And these wonderful little details about how people who live together for that long understand one another. And there's a kind of beauty in that, I think, that I really appreciated in that relationship.
And it's the easy making fun of each other,
Yeah.
those easy jokes where it's they hide their emotions because they're caravan guards, and they hide their emotions, they disguise them in making jokes, making fun of each other, being mean to each other
Yeah.
in all those sorts of ways that we do with a lot of our extremely close friends, that we're very comfortable making fun of them and them making fun of us because they are our friends. We know it is all good humored. We know that they care about us.
Yeah.
And that is an element of love that I think is important to understand in this context.
Yeah. You got that right, or Professor Fireballs. So so anyway, I think that covers the lover pretty well, and I'm glad that the diagram is still up, because now we need to talk about the caregiver. And the what is juxtaposed with the caregiver, I think, is a very good clue as to why this is different from the lover. And you have the coin that the caregiver is one side of, includes on its other side the slave, and the coin is called service. So the caregiver, do we want to talk about that in a general sense before we get into our examples?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's good to give a general sense of it, because for me, the caregiver is very much about supporting other people, of a
Uh-huh.
life of service, a life of dedication, a life of doing these things, a vocation. That these are all aspects of the caregiver, of trying to help other people. And sometimes that is at your own detriment, your own it's your own you have to make sacrifices to do this, and you subsume some of your own desires
Yeah.
in order to support other people. You give of your time, you give of your emotion, you give of your attention. um all of these are aspects of the caregiver. We've all had a friend who has needed us, where they have been very upset about something and they needed a shoulder to cry on, and that's the role of the caregiver. You are there to support them. And I'm sure we've all been that friend
Yeah.
where we have needed someone else to support us in a moment, and they then became our caregiver. So that's part of what I mean, or I understand,
Yeah.
by caregiver, in this sense that it's someone whose role in the narrative is very much about supporting other people, is the almost like the heart of what is going on,
Yeah.
and is there to make sure that others succeed.
Yeah, beautiful. Another thing that you mentioned before we started recording, and I think it's something we should mention in the video, you brought up the various Greek words for love, and so the lover being related to the aspect of eros, whereas caregiver is related to the aspect of agape, which is compassion, emotional support, as you said, that sort of thing, as opposed to the physicality, the attraction of eros. So I think,
And I suppose you could also think of agape almost like brotherly love. If
yes.
we think of all military fantasy, or even military fiction in general, the band of brothers.
Yeah.
When we think of fraternity, sorority, not the university things in the US, but fraternity and sorority as the feeling of brotherhood, of sisterhood, of
Right.
found family.
Yeah.
That these are all aspects of that banding together, supporting one another. These are aspects of caregiving,
Yeah.
and it can be an interesting way to look at certain characters.
Yeah. For example, I think a great example, and this is a perfect segue, really, when you talk about that kind of those kinds of bonds. The classic example for those of us who love this genre of fantasy would probably be Sam and Frodo from Lord of the Rings, right? I mean, they're that kind of caregiving, that Sam being the caregiver, and Frodo being the object of that care. and the support that he gives him, the friendship that he gives him. And for many people, Sam is even the hero of the Lord of the Rings because of that. But he's a character that I think wins a lot of, for a lot of us, wins our admiration and our affection because of that supportiveness that he's like a rock, he supports Frodo in every situation. And he's a friend. I mean, that's, you think of the essence of friendship, and you think of what Sam does there in getting Frodo to where he needs to go, and sacrificing, on his own part, which, if we get into the shadow part of that sacrifice becomes something darker, doesn't it? Where the term used is slave, but for Sam, it's all coming willingly, and it's we see it as a beautiful thing.
Well, you see, and this is where I would slightly disagree, because I think there are moments where Sam actually is slipping into slave,
Uh-huh.
because so much of Sam's story is actually entirely dependent on Frodo. That he is in this, he cannot get away.
Hmm.
He cannot escape from it because he feels trapped. Now, he may willingly be trapped, but he is trapped by his love and service to Frodo.
Yeah.
And we can see the dark element here of what the caregiver is, someone who has sacrificed so much of themselves
Mm-hmm.
that they have lost their own. They have lost their own essence and are now merely trapped in a relationship with someone where they are constantly supporting someone else
Yeah.
and never receiving that support back. And I
Mm.
think Sam's arc is very interesting because we see shades of that, but ultimately it always, for me, ends up back in Caregiver, because it is clear that Frodo does care for Sam, that the
Yeah.
hobbits supporting one another. That if we think about it from Sam's perspective, there are moments when Frodo supports him. Now,
Right.
they are few and far between in comparison,
Right.
because when we think about it from Frodo's perspective, it's pretty much Sam supporting him the entire time.
Yeah.
So you can see how something that can be very beneficial, can be very, very good, it's easy to see how it can slip into something darker and something less benevolent and less
Mhm.
good, less bright.
Yeah. It's a relationship that I think a lot of us get very emotional about. And perhaps because of that slippage between caregiver and slave as well. I mean, it is emotionally exhausting sometimes to sort of be with Sam while he's trying to support Frodo. Another good example of that, I think
No,
it's a
no, but hang on. Before we move on,
yeah.
it's emotionally exhausting being your friend, Philip. You just take, take, take. But what I actually wanted to talk about here, just before we move on to
Sure.
another example,
Yeah.
is this is where we can see that very clear thing where something that can start out very good can slip into that.
Uh-huh.
And that is something that is, I think, is very interesting about Caregiver, far more than a lot of the other archetypes. The slippage between those 2 points, where we can feel that when the narrative is with us, when we are central to the story,
Hmm.
we can see when people take from us, and we feel like we are being enslaved emotionally in that respect because our narrative is with us. But if we think about it from their perspective,
Hmm.
sometimes we forget about all the times that we have been taking from them.
Yeah.
And I think this is a fascinating thing, particularly about this archetype and about this shifting in narrative perspective that we talked about. That this is one of those ones that frequently in relationships, we note all the times that someone does us wrong, someone is taking from us, someone is doing things that annoy us, and we add them all up in our head and go, you're constantly doing this,
Uh,
and you feel trapped, and it's negative. But if we ask that other person, they go, yeah, but you do all of these things, and again the negativity builds up.
yeah.
And it is very easy in real life to always focus on these negative aspects, and yet it's not just about that slave aspect. It is caregiver. Think about the positive aspects. All those times that the other person supported you.
Yeah.
And then to remember to value yourself in all the times that you have supported them. We
Mm.
know when we support someone else. We sometimes forget when they support us.
Yeah, yeah, so true. It's wonderful how we can pluck examples from literature and from fantasy, but this stuff applies to life, doesn't it? So we've got another example that I want to do next because I think it does relate to some of the things we were saying, excuse me, a moment ago, in regard to Sam and Frodo and the slippage into from caregiver into slave. And the example is going to be a spoiler from Dead House Gates. This is book 2 of the Malazan Book of the Fallen. And the example is everybody will, if you've read that book, you will never be able to forget, I think, the relationship between Mappo and Icarium. And Mappo obviously being the caregiver in this case. And I think it's pretty easy to see where it gets problematic, where Mappo's devotion to Icarium becomes a part of a crisis for Mappo. And in part, it has to do with the circumstances around which he initially became Icarium's, well, I guess traveling companion is one way to put it. But so Mappo, this is spoilers for Dead House Gates, but he was put there by the Nameless Ones in order to essentially keep Icarium in check and also to deliver Icarium at the right time to a fate that would not necessarily be a very desirable one. And the problem for Mappo is he's become very devoted to his companion. So he's in a very difficult position. And what I think a lot of the pathos that comes from that book, and there's a lot of pathos in that book, but I think one of the more, for me anyway, one of the arcs that just really affects me emotionally is that relationship between Mappo and Icarium. And they are like brothers. They are very close friends in some respects, but there are these secrets between them that are rotting, I think, festering, especially in Mappo. Because of what he's holding back and how he knows he's supposed to ultimately betray Icarium. But he also becomes a slave to this relationship too, doesn't he, in some respects? So even more than Sam and Frodo, I think this exhibits major slippage between caregiver and slave. Do you agree?
Yeah, and actually, one of the things I find fascinating about Mappo and Icarium is we can actually see elements both of Lover and Seducer as well,
Sure.
in that we have Mappo basically seducing Icarium, arriving with these nefarious plans that are serving these interests that he is involved in that have nothing to do with Icarium's best interests. So it's very much that seduction aspect of creating this relationship to serve your own ends. But it moves through then into love and lover. Now, and again, as I was saying, it's not necessarily sex, but this deep abiding love between the characters. And it's clear that when Icarium remembers, he does remember that he loves Mappo, and they care about one another. And so we can see that aspect being investigated with Mappo and Icarium. Yeah. This movement between the seducer to the lover. We can also then see, as you pointed out, that aspect of caregiver and slave, that movement between the two, that in some respects Mappo is trapped. Yeah. But is he trapped by his own making? Is he trapped because of previous things? Is it actually his relationship to the Nameless Ones to which he is enslaved? All of these things, thinking about the archetypes helps us sometimes find interesting questions to ask of the characters, to ask about the characters. That helps us understand the narrative and understand the character functions and roles and their arcs a little bit better and see it in a different light.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, we had one more example, which I think should be fairly interesting, and it's a bit more positive than the previous two. I think it's fair to say. And this is, again, from the Farseer trilogy. So spoilers, slight spoilers for the Farseer trilogy. This is the relationship. It's an interesting one, I think, because of several factors, but it's the relationship between Patience and Fitz. Patience, in this case, being a caregiver. And I love this particular arc because of Patience's position in relation to Fitz. Fitz is the child of her deceased husband, Chivalry. He is a bastard. And so he is not her child. And so this puts her in a very interesting relationship to him, because you could easily see how a woman, particularly she is herself childless as well, so you could see how that could lead to some resentment in that particular relationship. But that's not what happens, and it's kind of beautiful actually what does develop between these two. And it is, I think, a lot of it is on Patience and her decision in terms of how, and there's this moment, I think, when they first meet, when I think she's kind of deciding what this is going to be. And you see her make that decision in a way that immediately won my affection for her character. But she does certain things to look out for him, doesn't she, Patience? He has lots of figures in this, like Birch and others, but I really love the affection that develops between him and Patience as a result of her decision to be a caregiver for him.
And I think this is another brilliant example of how complex characters can transcend these sort of archetypes that we're talking about, because that archetype of the caregiver, we can see that element of the relationship, that element of the story. But then we think about the complexity of that relationship, because it isn't a simple matter of devotion. There's an element of Patience feeling in some way she now has to be responsible for Fitz, and also hurt by Fitz's mere presence, because Fitz, remember, is a reminder of her husband's infidelity.
Yeah.
But Fitz is also painful for her, distressing for her to look like, because he is a constant reminder of her dead husband who she loved.
Yes.
And so there's a depth and a complexity to the emotions at play here that transcend and go beyond the simple construct of the archetype. Right. But we can see that as a role or a function that she is fulfilling within the narrative. And then because we can see that, we can see how these other things interplay with it. And it gives us this insight into her character, and it helps us appreciate her, I think, a lot more.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's Hobb for you, right? I mean, she just does a great job with these characters and introducing such layers of complexity. And yet it's kind of cool how we can understand the characters through these categories, through these archetypes. I think it does add some appreciation for how these characters function in the story as well. So very nice. Anything else we want to say for the good of the order in regard to either lovers or caregivers? And I'm sure, once again, do you want to take me up on that bet this time?
That we know 100% as fact that people watching this are smarter than us and have read far more than us and go, oh no, but I can think of far better examples. Because we didn't even talk about how we could maybe see like the veteran soldier, the gruff veteran who is part of a quest group, who's kind of like a father figure to them all. Like that feeds in as caregiver, because they are a central figure who treats everyone as their children and has that love for the rest of the quest group. I mean, that's an aspect we could see in Caregiver. In terms of Lover, we ignored a lot of the femme fatale aspects and all of it, because it is that a lot of them are stereotyped and cliched and trite. And this, I think, was a much more interesting discussion than going into those things. But they obviously are all applicable examples as well, that you can move between seducer and lover in that fashion. So there's so much here about trying to distill these relationships down, and then once you've done that, think, oh, but it doesn't take account of this aspect.
Right.
And that's where we start to see how complex these characters actually are that these authors have created for us. So that's about all I would add. Nemesis.
Well, it has been a pleasure once again discussing all of this with you. And I think we have quite a few more videos in the series to go. This is a lot of fun.
Well,
I think
yeah,
we're gonna have some good videos coming up on this one. So
because I think like even once we've finished with the Jungian archetypes, then we can move on to mythological archetypes, and then we can move on to other literary archetypes, and then we can move on to tropes. Like, I mean, there's so much here to discuss about these various symbols and these metaphors and things that work their way into fantasy that sometimes we interpret the same way and other times have interesting connotations or interesting backstories. And I think it's a lot of fun to explore this because the more you know about this stuff, it can add so much more to your enjoyment because, one of the most common things that we talk about in fantasy today is we talk about the subversion of tropes.
yeah.
But if you don't know where the trope comes from, if you don't know what the trope actually is, how can you recognize a subversion? And if everyone is always subverting the trope and the trope is subversion, when they subvert the subversion, does it become the original trope? These are the questions that keep me awake at night. But, but these are the sorts of things that the more you know about it, the more they can be really fascinating little insights into the text that we love.
Yeah, and a lot of fun too. All right, well, thank you, my friend. I mean, my nemesis, my
My
fremesis,
frenemy.
my fremesis. All right, well, don't scorch
Thank you very much,
anybody.
Philip.
Don't scorch anybody I know anyway. So take care.